Alright, so in this lesson we're going to begin our table setting project, which is going to give you all the tools and techniques that you need to really begin modeling at a very basic level in 3 dimensions in Maya. The tutorial is going to assume that you already have the basics of navigating the interface down. I will reiterate different hotkeys that I'm using from time to time, but primarily we're going to be focused on modeling different shapes. And we're going to go ahead and start with the fork. We're going to model a fork, knife, and a spoon. We're going to model a table, and we're going to model a chair. Actually, why don't we go ahead and start with a table? That'll probably be the easiest. So let's go ahead and start with a cylinder. So I'm going to create a cylinder. Remember, we're going to drag on the base of the grid to create the overall size of the shape, and then click and drag again to set the height. So there's the top of our table. And the first thing that I notice about this is that it of course is semi-round, but let's say that I didn't want that to be as round as it is. I wanted fewer corners on the sides. What we're going to do is go to our channel box, and if we go up to the upper right here, you should have a few tabs: channel box, modeling toolkit, attribute editor. If you don't have the modeling toolkit, don't worry about it just yet. But let's go ahead and tab up to our channel box, and there we're going to find subdivisions. So for the subdivisions axis, note that if I hover the 20, my mouse changes to a series of left and right pointing arrows, and if I simply click and drag left, I'm going to be able to set fewer or more axis subdivisions, and with more, the shape's profile is going to be more round. With fewer, it's going to be more geometric. Okay. For this one, I'll just go ahead and set my axis divisions to 6. You don't necessarily need the same number as I have. You can set yours to whatever value you like, but for caps, let's go ahead and each have 2. Okay. With 2 cap divisions, you'll note that we have now subdivided the number of times that the shape has been cut along the top and bottom. Okay. 3 divisions would look like this. And again, I can click and drag more or less. More, it kind of becomes a spider's web. Less, it just gives us a little more geometry to work with. Let's start with 2. So with 2, what we can do is go around to the bottom of this shape, and if you remember from one of the previous demos, we have our sub-object select modes that we can access by right-clicking. So if I right-click and hold, I can select face mode, and that's going to allow me to select faces on the bottom or top of the shape. If I hold shift on my keyboard, I can select multiple. So I can select all the faces, just the faces in the center. If I hold control, notice that I get a little minus next to my selection tool. I'm going to deselect things by holding control. So I'm going to shift select all the faces on the bottom side of this cylinder, and I'm going to go ahead and extrude them out. In order to do that, the hotkey for extrude is Control E, okay? And Control E is going to bring up this manipulator. We have a few different options. We're going to leave those alone for now. We're simply going to drag down on the blue arrow, and that's our Z depth axis. We're going to pull that down. It's going to let us build new faces off of the faces that we had before, okay? The arrows are different from the squares on this tool. Okay, the cubes at the ends of the tool are for scaling, and the arrows are for moving. So if I wanted to say scale the result that I had here, I could click on the scale manipulator on the x-axis, which is the red cube, and scale it in, and you'll see that the result is kind of squashing down. Okay, I'm going to leave that alone for now. And I'm going to go back and click on my selection tool again. Once I click on my select tool, I'm done extruding. I've now finished with my extrusion, but I have extra geometry I can play with. If I want to, I can go into vertex mode and select the verts along the bottom and scale them in. Right? So now they taper to a base that's a little bit more narrow. Alternatively, I could select the edges at the base where the column meets the top of the table. If you want to select multiple, again, you can hold shift, right? But also, if you're selecting edges, if you have a ring, typically you can double click one edge and it will select the whole loop. And I'll show you what I mean here. If I double click this edge, it's going to select the entire ring. And if I go into wireframe, you can see that more easily. So that mode is selected. I've selected the entire ring. I could then scale that loop of edges, smaller or larger, and that's going to change the profile of my table. I'm going to scale mine down just a bit and give it something that looks a little bit more like a pedestal. I can then go back to object mode, and there's my table. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and move this table off to the side for now, and we're going to begin sculpting for our fork. Our fork is going to teach us some new techniques that we can use to model, and then you can carry those techniques through to the table if you want to revise that after the fact. So for our fork, let's go ahead and create a long cube, sort of like a 2x4. So we have our long rectangular cube here, and again, the size of shapes and objects does not matter in Maya in the beginning, only their proportion does, because we can scale the objects to any size after we're finished working on them. For the fork, I know that I need a few things, right? When I think about what a fork looks like, I realize that there are tines, the points that stick out at the end of the fork, and I know that typically there are going to be 4 of those. So I'm going to need to subdivide this thing at least enough times to get 4 tines pulled out from the fork. Let's take our width divisions and set those to 4, okay? Then we're going to take our height divisions. Nope, no height divisions. We don't need height divisions here. You can see that dividing along the edge here is just going to create dense polygon areas that we're not going to be modeling on anyway. So let's leave our height division set to 1 and change our depth divisions. We're going to increase that number. Let's do about 4 for that. So we'll do 4, 1, and 4. Now, to get the tines off the end of this fork, we're going to do an extrusion like we did for the base of the table, but we're going to change an option. So I'm going to go to face mode. Again, right click and hold, select faces. I'll hold shift and select each of the ends of the fork and hit Control E. But now I want to change this keep faces together option to off. So I'm going to turn that option off and pull these faces out. And they look, at first blush, they appear as if they've stuck together. But if we go to our scale tool, which if you remember from the previous is the cube next to the x-axis move manipulator, we're going to grab that box and scale them on the X and watch what happens. They're separating. So they've been extruded separately, and now we can taper the ends to get a nice point. And that's going to be the basic profile shape that we need to sculpt on to create our fork. I'll go back to my select tool, and now I'm going to go into vertex mode and I'm going to begin sculpting. I know that the handle of my fork should be more narrow than sort of the head of the fork, so I'm going to select all the verts along the back half. I'm doing that by just left clicking and dragging a marquee, that's that dotted line box shape, around all the verts that I want. You can see it selected the top and bottom. And then I'm simply going to scale them in with R. If you remember, W, E, and R are move, rotate, and scale. So W, move, E, rotate, R is scale. So I'm going to scale those in, and then I'll just select the verts along the back and I'll move them down because the fork is proportionally right now a little bit off. Take the head of the fork and scale it a bit shorter. Move those back. I'll scale them more narrow. So I'm simply just changing the overall proportion of my object by selecting vertices, moving them and scaling them until it looks right to me. This is pretty good. One of the major problems with it right now is that forks are not flat. If we go ahead and pull up some reference imagery, I'm going to pull up my browser here. Can bring this onto the screen for a minute. If we go to Google and we look up what a fork looks like, go to images, you'll notice that forks have a sort of ergonomic profile where the neck of the fork is raised And then of course the head of the fork, the part that you eat with, is set to an angle. It's diagonal. So we can go ahead and model ours based on that profile, right? I'm going to go ahead and take this and move it to my other monitor. Put that over here for now. I'm going to take the verts that I have here along the neck, and I'm going to move them up. Great, I now have a nice bend, but it's a little bit flat here, so I'm going to move these up a little bit less so. And you can sort of see the profile of the fork coming together now. I'll select all the verts along the front half, and I'm going to move those up with my move tool, again W. Then just the verts at the very tip, and I'll move them up even more. And so now I have something that really resembles a nice fork. It's a little bit geometric, a little bit blocky. However, I have the option to smooth this. We have three options in our viewport. We have the number 1 on your keyboard is going to show the object as it's been modeled. Number 2 is going to show a smooth preview underneath of the original wireframe, okay? And then number 3 on your keyboard is going to simply show a smooth preview of the model. I can model on the smooth preview as easily as I was able to model on the base mesh, so I can go to vertex mode here, and if I don't like, say, that the tines are not quite long enough, I could take this group of verts and move them in. I could take all the verts on the end and kind of move them out. Okay. You can see the profile right now is sort of coming together nicely. These have been raised up just a little bit, so I'm going to push them back down sort of to where they started. Okay. Give that a nice gentle curvature. And now we'll go back to object mode. I can change the taper on the neck here, so I could go to vertex mode, and I'm going to take just this group of verts. Notice I'm marqueeing them. Anytime I drag a marquee, it's because I want the verts not simply on the top, but on the bottom as well. If I click and hold shift, I could get the verts along the top side, but then the bottom verts wouldn't come along with it. So let's drag a marquee to select those instead. And then I'm simply going to scale these in. And I could even widen the base a bit more, just to make that more dramatic. Suddenly I have a fork that is looking a whole lot more like something you would want to eat with. I'm going to go ahead and lengthen it just a bit more by dragging these verts backward. And I'm pretty happy with this overall. The proportions on this look pretty good, so now all I have to do is right click and hold and select object mode. And I'm going to scale the entire fork down with R again, so I'll hit scale. If we scale from one axis, it's going to scale the fork longer or shorter. If we scale from all axes at once here in the center, we can simply make it smaller. So I'm going to make it quite a bit smaller. And I'm going to position it with my move tool over on the table. Relative to the table, it's still pretty large, so I'll scale it down again. And then I will set it in place. And so there is our fork set on our table very nicely. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and conclude this demo. And for the next demo, we're going to make a knife and a spoon.